In the depths of the exclusion zone, far beyond the rusted gates of Pripyat, there is a place where time did not simply stop. It seems to have shattered. While much of Chernobyl was looted or slowly taken back by nature, there is one specific room, hidden in the shadows of a ruined building, where 4 decades of dust rest over furniture left almost perfectly untouched. The door has remained closed since the exact moment it was hurriedly shut in 1986. And what we are about to find inside today defies the very logic of abandonment. Before we open that door together, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Stories like this, stories that rescue human memory from being forgotten, need people who understand the weight of history. Now get ready, because what this room reveals about the final day of an era is something you have never seen before. When we close our eyes and hear the name Chernobyl, the same images almost always rise in our minds like a conditioned reflex. We picture the blue glow of the exposed reactor core. We hear the piercing sound of emergency sirens, and we imagine the absolute chaos of a night that changed the course of modern history. But if we step away just for a moment from the roar of the explosion and the panic of those first responders, we find something that, from a documentary point of view, is far more disturbing: the silence that came after. There is a fundamental difference between destruction caused by fire and destruction caused by absence, and it is exactly on that thin line between what once was and what would never be again that today's story takes place. While the world focused on the radioactive cloud drifting across borders, inside small apartments in the city of Pripyat, life simply stopped in the middle of a sentence. We are not talking only about a nuclear disaster. We are talking about thousands of human clocks being frozen at the same time, leaving behind a trail of intimacy that time itself could not erase. What remained was not just rubble. It was fragments of who those people were. And the most haunting part is realizing that, even after 4 decades, the essence of those homes still pulses beneath the layers of dust. But there was one detail that few people ever notice. Not every place was swallowed by chaos or vandalism. Today I invite you to cross the threshold with me into one of those preserved spaces. We are about to enter an ordinary room that became a frozen portrait, a time capsule where every object, from an open book to a coat still hanging in place, tells the story of a morning that should have been just another ordinary Tuesday. It is a place that forces us to question what we truly value inside our own homes. If you are the kind of person who sees beauty in the melancholy of history and believes that every object carries a soul, I ask you to stay with me on this journey. And if you have not yet subscribed, consider doing so we can continue preserving these memories together. Because what we are about to see is not just an empty room. It is the silent testimony of a life interrupted without warning. And that alone changes everything we think we know about the legacy of Chernobyl. After all, how can we understand the magnitude of a collective loss without first looking into the eyes of one individual story? Get ready. From this moment on, we leave the noise of the modern world behind and enter the realm of absolute silence. To understand the absolute silence that now dominates that room, we must first recover the sound of that city on the day before the disaster. Pripyat was not a rustic village or an improvised settlement. It was the pride of the Soviet regime, an atom grad designed to be a paradise for Ukraine's brightest workers and scientists. Imagine for a moment walking along those wide avenues in the spring of 1986. The air carried the scent of blooming apple trees. Young couples pushed baby strollers along spotless sidewalks. And the city center pulsed with the modernity of theaters, Olympic-sized swimming pools, and cafes that could rival those of European capitals. It was a young city, with an average age of only 26, where the promise of stability and progress seemed as solid as the concrete of its buildings. The people who lived there felt as if they had made it. They had access to consumer goods that were rare in other parts of the Soviet Union, and enjoyed a level of privilege few could claim. But the problem was that all this security rested on a foundation of glass that no one could see. On the morning of April 26th, while Reactor 4 was already burning and the sky was carrying invisible particles of graphite and nuclear fuel over the balconies, life in Pripyat continued in a terrifyingly normal way. Children went to school. Fishermen sat along the canal. Housewives opened their windows to let in the morning sun. There was no immediate alarm, no warning siren cutting through the air. Radiation, silent and odorless, began settling over clothes hanging on laundry lines and toys left behind in gardens. And it was in that exact moment of collective ignorance that the fate of the room we are about to visit began to be sealed. Only the next day, 36 hours after the initial explosion, did the government finally admit the inevitable. And the way it happened changed everything we understand about the psychology of abandonment. At 2 p.m., on April 27th, loudspeakers across the city came to life with a calm, monotonous female voice announcing a temporary evacuation. The order was clear. People were to take only what they needed for 3 days: personal documents and light clothing. The government insisted that everything would soon return to normal, and that the evacuation was only a precautionary measure for sanitation. And this is where the tragedy becomes personal. Thousands of people closed their doors firmly believing they would come back to finish dinner, wash the dishes left in the sink, or water the plants already beginning to wilt. That promise of 3 days was the final blow to the material history of Pripyat. Because residents believed they would return quickly, they left behind family photographs, wedding albums, savings hidden under mattresses, and sentimental objects that could not fit inside a small travel bag. They left home the way someone leaves for a weekend away, never imagining it would be the last time they would feel their key turning in the lock. But there was one detail no one mentioned at that moment. Radiation is not something you wash away with soap and water. Those homes, those rooms, and every object inside them instantly became the property of time and contamination. As 1,200 buses formed an endless line, crossing bridges and leaving the city like a funeral procession of metal and smoke, Pripyat began to die from within. What had once been a home became an exhibit capsule. The silence that settled there was not the silence of a city saying goodbye. It was the silence of a city interrupted in the middle of a breath. And the strangest thought is this. While residents looked through the bus windows waiting for the day they would return, nature and radiation had already begun reclaiming what now belonged to them. This context of haste and false hope explains why some places, like the room we are about to investigate, carry such a dense aura of human presence. There was no time for mourning, no time for farewell. There was only the slam of a door and an emptiness that would never again be filled. Leaving Pripyat's main avenue and walking toward the residential districts feels like entering a dimension where physics and biology have decided to rewrite the rules. In the previous section, we saw the exact moment when the city was paused. Now we must understand what happened during the 40 years in which mankind was absent. As we move between the Soviet-style apartment blocks, we realize that silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is almost a physical presence, something that seems to weigh on the shoulders of anyone who dares to walk here. The asphalt, once marked by bus tires and the hurried footsteps of workers, is now a patchwork of cracks where birch and oak roots force their way toward the sun. It is a powerful image, and for many of us, a deeply melancholic one. To see the raw force of nature taking back, inch by inch, what technological progress had once claimed with so much pride. As we approach the building where the room is located, the atmosphere changes. You do not hear birdsong as often as you would expect in an ordinary forest. Instead, you hear the metallic groan of loose windows and the constant crack of concrete fragments breaking away from the facades. Every step over a floor covered in broken glass produces a sharp sound, an echo that seems to travel for miles through the empty vastness of the city. And the problem is that the deeper we move into these residential complexes, the stronger the feeling becomes that we are being watched by thousands of dark windows, like empty eyes in a story that has lost its light. But strangely, there is something reverent about this path. For those who lived through the age of great construction projects, looking at these buildings is to recognize a monumental human effort that, in only a few hours, became obsolete and dangerous. As we cross the building's main lobby, the air suddenly becomes colder and heavier. Here, sunlight struggles to enter, filtered through dust that dances in the beams like tiny suspended ghosts. The first detail that catches our attention is the mailboxes. For a generation that still understands the weight of a handwritten letter, seeing those small twisted metal doors, still holding newspapers dated April 1986, is a shock of reality. There are bills that were never paid, invitations to May celebrations that never happened, news from a world that no longer exists. Those papers, now yellowed and brittle, are the final communications of a society silenced at the height of its activity. At this point, we understand that we are not merely inside an abandoned building. We are inside an organism that stopped functioning suddenly, with blood still running through its concrete veins. Climbing the stairs requires patience and caution. The elevator, once a symbol of modernity, is stuck between floors, its rusted iron doors half open, revealing a dark and silent shaft. Each flight of stairs takes us farther from the outside world and closer to the heart of the mystery. What makes this climb especially tense is what the other apartments reveal along the way. In most of them, doors have been ripped away or left wide open, exposing rooms overturned by looters who, in the 1990s, defied radiation in search of anything that could be sold on the black market. We see torn sofas, shattered tube televisions, and clothes scattered across the floor, forming a carpet of memories dishonored by vandalism. In many ways, human destruction feels more painful than natural decay. But as we reach the upper floor, the scene begins to change dramatically. The disorder we saw below gives way to a strange, almost unnatural sense of order. And this changes everything we think we know about exploring Chernobyl. For some reason that logic does not immediately explain. The higher we climb, the more time seems to have preserved the dignity of these spaces. The silence here is different. It is not the silence of vandalism. It is the silence of waiting. The peeling walls reveal layers of floral wallpaper, typical of Soviet homes, while the smell of mold blends with the metallic scent of radioactive dust, creating a sensory signature unique to Pripyat. Every closed door we pass seems to hold an individual story, a capsule of 1986 oxygen that has not yet been contaminated by the air of the 21st century. Standing before this specific door, at the end of a dim corridor heavy with static electricity, is an experience that defies time. For anyone who has spent decades caring for their own home, protecting privacy and family security, there is something deeply sacred about the idea of a closed door. In Pripyat, most entrances were violated. Doors were broken down by soldiers searching for survivors, by liquidators looking for contaminants, or later by ruthless looters. But this unit, number 42, seems to have been protected by a conspiracy of circumstances. What we see here is not just wood and metal. It is an intact barrier between the modern world, loud and connected, and the absolute silence of 1986. And the strangest detail, the one that makes us hesitate, is that the dust on the handle carries not a single pressure mark. It is a fine gray sediment, accumulated year after year, as if the atmosphere itself had been guarding that secret beneath an invisible dome. The problem is that in a place like Chernobyl, untouched is either a synonym for danger or for a mystery many preferred not to investigate. Why did the looters who tore through almost every lower floor looking for copper radiators or forgotten jewelry ignore this apartment? Perhaps radiation readings here were too high in the 1990s, creating an invisible barrier of fear that kept intruders away. Or perhaps in a more poetic and disturbing way, the door fit so tightly into its frame that a vacuum of dust sealed it like an ancient tomb. Looking closely at the keyhole, we see no signs of skeleton keys or forced entry. The white paint, now yellowed and cracked like the shell of an old egg, still holds firm on its hinges, guarding the stagnant air of an era the rest of the world has already buried. But there was one detail that completely changed our perception as we examined the structure. At the top of the doorframe, we noticed a small paper seal, nearly disintegrated, probably placed there by a Soviet security officer in the weeks following the disaster. That seal was meant to show whether someone had illegally entered the place. And it is intact. That means that officially no one has crossed this threshold since the last family left in a hurry to board the evacuation buses. And this changes everything we know about the preservation of memory in Chernobyl. Usually what we see in documentaries are staged rooms, objects arranged by photographers to create dramatic scenes. But here, the promise is absolute, unfiltered truth. A chance to see history exactly as it was left, untouched by the modern human hand. We cross the threshold. The moment a foot touches the wooden floor of this room for the first time in 40 years is not only a physical movement, it is an almost spiritual transition between the present and a past that refuses to disappear. For anyone who, like many of us, values the silence of a well-kept home and the peace of a private refuge, entering this place sends an involuntary chill through the body. The still air we mentioned before hits the face with a density that can almost be felt on the skin. It is not only the smell of mold or old paper, it is the smell of time trapped indoors, a mixture of mineral dust, fabric slowly falling apart, and the chemical trace of an industrial age that did not yet understand the limits of safety. In essence, it is the smell of 1986, preserved like a sample in a laboratory of history. The first thing that strikes us, however, is not what we see. It is the absolute feeling of interruption. When the flashlight beam or the pale sunlight that manages to pierce the soot layered across the windows cuts through the room, what we see is not the chaos of ruins we are used to seeing on the news. What we see is order. A ghostly order, yes. But an order that reveals life here did not end with a blast. It ended with suspension. The dust, which here works like an eternal gray snow, covers every horizontal surface with mathematical precision. It rests on the dome of a silk lampshade on the top of a dark oak bookcase, and over the keys of a typewriter that seems to be waiting for the next paragraph. To a careful eye, this dust is not dirt. It is the graphic record of silence. Every particle deposited there represents a day, a month, a decade in which no human being breathed inside this room. We now approach the emotional core of our journey. The moment when the statistics of a nuclear disaster dissolve and give way to the human face of the tragedy. For anyone who has spent decades building a life, choosing each piece of furniture, and arranging memories on shelves, this section may be the most powerful of all. We are no longer looking at Chernobyl as a historical event in books. We are looking into the intimacy of someone who, like any of us, believed in the safety of their own roof. As we point the flashlight into the corners of the room, we realize that what was left behind is not merely stuff. These are extensions of the soul of whoever lived here. The first thing that draws our attention, occupying almost an entire wall, is the famous Stenka, the Soviet modular wall unit that was the pride of almost every home of that era. For an audience that lived through the Cold War period and understands the value of furniture built to last for generations, seeing this heavy wooden structure, with its glass doors still intact, is like seeing the skeleton of a stability that collapsed. Behind the glass, covered by a haze of radioactive dust, we can still see the crystal and porcelain sets reserved only for major family celebrations. They are still there, aligned with almost military precision, waiting for a birthday toast or a Christmas dinner that never came. The shine of crystal beneath the dust is a powerful image. It represents the dignity and effort of a life that was suddenly treated as disposable before the invisible force of the atom. But the problem is that, when we look closer, the details begin to reveal the agonizing haste of that Sunday afternoon. On the coffee table, there is an open edition of Pravda. The news talks about industrial production targets and the successes of socialism, completely unaware that only a few miles away, the city was already condemned. Beside the newspaper, a pair of reading glasses rests on the page. As if the owner had only stood up to answer the door or check something in the kitchen, there are no signs of disorder, and that makes everything even more disturbing. Nothing was prepared for a long absence. and nothing was finished. It is the pure aesthetic of interruption. To an attentive observer, this scene is like a silent scream traveling across the decades, reminding us that tragedy rarely announces when it is coming over for coffee. As we mentally close the door to this room, or take our final step toward the exit, we are struck by a realization rarely found in other historic places. Usually when we visit museums or ancient ruins, we feel the distance of time. We know those people lived in another era, with different values and different tools. But here, the problem is that the distance is too short. For many of us who remember exactly where we were in 1986, this room is not an archaeological artifact. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront the idea that civilization, with all its technical progress and structures of power, is held together by an extremely thin thread of normality. What this room truly means is not only abandonment caused by radiation, it is the frightening fragility of what we call home. And this reveals something that goes far beyond the Chernobyl nuclear accident. This space became involuntarily a monument to the interruption of life. When we talk about disasters, we focus on physical destruction. But here, the destruction was temporal. Time was stolen from the people who lived in this apartment. If we think about it, our home is the one place in the world where we feel in complete control. It is where we organize our memories, where we protect the people we love, where we plan tomorrow. Seeing this frozen room, we understand that the Soviet state did not only evacuate people, it kidnapped their future. Every object we have examined here represents a promise made to the next day. A promise that was never kept. We have reached the end of our physical journey through the corridors of Pripyat. But the emotional journey awakened by this room is far from over. As we leave the building and feel once again the breeze blowing in from the nearby forest, it is impossible not to look back and see those windows as frames in an accidental art gallery. We leave Unit 42 behind. But the truth is, the room does not leave us. It remains engraved in our memory as a vivid reminder that our existence is made of a sequence of small gestures we rarely value until they become impossible. Chernobyl is not merely a technological breaking point. Above all, it is the place where time was interrupted in the middle of a breath. If this story touched you in any way, I ask you not to let that feeling fade. Our channel is a place dedicated to preserving these memories. So if you are not yet part of our community, subscribe now, leave a like, and tell me where you are watching from. Your experiences enrich our narrative. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of silence. Until our next journey through the history that time tried to hide.